30% of all the oil that moves the world passes through a 33-kilometer corridor. When this corridor closes, it's not just the market that stops. It is the survival chain for billions of people. What the world calls a geopolitical crisis, the texts of the prophet Ezekiel already described as the movement of pieces on a board much larger than any chancellor can see. Observe the map for a moment. On the north side, Iran. On the south side, Oman and the Emiratos Árabes Unidos. Between the two, 33 kilometers of water that represent the most strategic artery on the planet. On average, 21 million barrels of oil transit through there per day. Approximately 18 tankers cross this passage every 24 hours, carrying enough energy to power economies that have no substitute for this flow. Japan, Korea do Sul, India, China, entire nations depend on this water to keep their industries running, their hospitals supplied, and their transportation moving. There is no viable logistical substitute. No alternative route exists that can absorb this volume without tripling the cost and quintupling the delivery time. When the Estreito de Ormuz closes, the world does not slow down. The world stops, and the world stopped. Markets reacted in a matter of hours. The price of a barrel of oil skyrocketed 42% in less than 3 days. Stock exchanges in Tokyo, Frankfurt, and New York recorded drops not seen since the financial crisis of 2008. Governments of desert nations called simultaneous emergency meetings. OTAN entered a state of high alert. American aircraft carriers were repositioned in the Golfo Persico and the Mar Arabico. News channels around the planet spent hours broadcasting analyses from geopolitical experts, economists, former generals, and diplomats, all trying to explain what was happening as if it were a surprise, as if no one had read the script before. It was not a surprise. What none of these experts factored into the equation is that this exact scenario, this specific nation, in this specific geographic position, exerting this specific type of pressure on the rest of the world, was recorded in documents written more than 2500 years ago, with names, with geographic directions, with consequences described in logical sequence. The world was in a panic over something that, for those who read the right archives, was nothing new. Consider the scenario carefully. The nation that controls the northern shore of the Estreito de Ormuz is Iran. Modern Iran is the territorial and cultural heir of ancient Persia, and Persia is not a peripheral detail of biblical prophecy. It is one of the most named, most described, and most detailed actors in all the prophetic literature of the ancient Middle East. The prophet Daniel, writing in the 6th century BC in Babylonia, described a ram that pushed to the west, to the north, and to the south, and before which no nation could stand. The biblical text itself, in Daniel chapter 8, verse 20, identifies this ram without leaving room for interpretation, the kings of Media and Persia. The map of the push described by Daniel is the map of contemporary Iranian influence. Yemen to the south, Syria to the north, Lebanon and Iraq to the west. The direction has not changed in 2500 years. 2500 years. Measure the weight of that. When Daniel wrote those words in clay, the concept of a strategic strait did not exist in any known military doctrine. Oil had no meaning as a power resource. The ancient world used firewood, charcoal, and animal fat. The word geopolitics had not been coined by any thinker in any language. And yet, the text describes with surgical precision the expansionist behavior of a nation that occupies that specific region of the globe, and does so in language that any contemporary intelligence analyst would recognize as operational and verifiable. Put into the right perspective, what Iran represents strategically at the beginning of this 21st century. The country possesses the largest fleet of ballistic missiles in the Middle East, with estimates pointing to an arsenal of more than 3,000 projectiles of different ranges and capabilities. In April de 2024, Iran launched more than 300 drones and missiles toward Israel in a single night, the largest direct attack by one sovereign state against another in decades. This event, which lasted approximately 5 hours of coordinated flight, mobilized the air defenses of Israel, the Estados Unidos, the Reino Unido, France, and Jordania simultaneously. Even so, it was treated by the international press predominantly as an isolated episode of regional tension. It was not an isolated episode. It was a demonstration of capability. Iranian naval forces operate in and around the Estreito de Ormuz, with a permanent presence of fast boats, midget submarines, and coastal missile systems installed on islands strategically positioned along the passage. The island of Abu Musa, the island of Grande Dotumb, and the island of Pequena Dotumb, all under Iranian control, all positioned to militarily cover the entrance and exit of the strait, were captured by Iran in Novembro de 1971 and never returned, despite formal territorial disputes that persist to this day between Iran and the Emiratos Árabes Unidos. From a military standpoint, these three islands form a triangle of control that transforms the strait into a supervised corridor. This is not improvisation. This is long-term strategic architecture. Iran has spent decades building exactly this position, the capacity to close, threaten, or control the flow of energy that feeds the most developed economies on the planet. And it did so with a consistency that spanned moderate and radical presidents, progressive sanctions, nuclear deals signed and torn up, and 4 decades of diplomatic hostility with the Estados Unidos. During the Iran-Iraqi War, which lasted 8 years from 1980 to 1988, Iran attacked 190 commercial ships in the Golfo Persico in a phase that became known as the Tanker War, demonstrating for the first time to the modern world that it was willing to use commercial navigation as an instrument of pressure. In 2019, it seized a British tanker and shot down an American military drone valued at more than $10 million. In 2023, its forces seized at least 3 foreign vessels in operations that analysts described as demonstrations of capability, messages sent without a single word needing to be spoken. The biblical text called this nation Persia and said it pushed without any animal being able to resist. The modern analyst calls this regional force projection. The vocabulary has changed, the pattern has not. Follow the reasoning of the prophet Ezekiel, because here the precision begins to bother in a way that no coincidence can elegantly explain. In Ezekiel chapter 38, God speaks to a character named Gogi from the land of Magog and describes a coalition of nations that will move against Israel in the end times. This coalition explicitly includes Persia, verse 5 of the same chapter. It also includes Ethiopia, Libya, and nations identified by scholars over centuries as corresponding to the territory of present-day Turkey, Russia, and modern Sudan. It is a coalition built around a military and ideological alliance that converges on the state of Israel from multiple geographic directions. Open the political map of the Middle East in any newspaper published in the last 10 years. Iran, Turkey, Russia, militias funded by Iran in Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. In 2023, Iran, Russia, and China held joint naval exercises in the Golfo de Omar, 100 kilometers from the Estreito de Ormuz. In 2022, Iran and Russia signed a military cooperation agreement valued at more than $400 million, including the supply of Iranian drones that were used in the conflict in Ukraine. Turkey, a member of OTAN that maintains commercial relations with Iran despite Western sanctions, has positioned itself increasingly autonomously regarding the Atlantic Alliance. This coalition is not being assembled in the wings of some prophecy. It is being reported in the news, discussed at security conferences, and analyzed by strategic research centers in Washington, Bruxelles, and Moscow. What Ezekiel described as a future formation, the contemporary world is calling a geopolitical realignment. Both descriptions point to the same phenomenon: realignment. Now observe what the records show about the specific geographic precision of this text. The Persian word used to describe the region that includes the Estreito de Ormuz and its surroundings in ancient historical documents is Elam, and Elam appears in Jeremiah chapter 49 as the object of a specific prophecy. The text of Jeremiah verse 35 says, "Behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the chief of their might." The following verses describe dispersion, terror over enemies, and agitation among nations. Historical commentators identify Elam as the region that corresponds on the modern map to the Iranian province of Khuzestan, which is exactly where Iran's largest oil reserves are concentrated, where the export infrastructure that feeds the Iranian economy is located, and where the pipelines that reach the loading terminals of the Golfo Persico originate. The text was not talking about a generic territory in the Middle East. It was talking about a specific address with a specific strategic function in a context that only makes full sense in the contemporary world. And here, the question that no one wants to ask must be placed on the table. If a document written in the 7th century BC can identify with geographic, political, and strategic precision the role of a specific nation in a conflict being broadcast live on 21st century news, what exactly is this document describing that the world still refuses to read seriously? The closing of the Estreito de Ormuz was not an isolated event. It was the most visible point of a process that has decades of construction and centuries of historical foundation. To understand why that 33-kilometer corridor became the nerve center of world politics, you need to understand what Persia has always been and what it never ceased to be. The Imperio Achaemenida, the first great Persian dynasty, existed for more than 220 years, from approximately 550 BC to 330 BC. At its height, it ruled over a territory that stretched from present-day Pakistan to eastern Graecia, from the Mar Caspio in the north to Egitto in the south. It was the largest empire the world had seen up to that point in history. More than 42% of the world's population at the time was under Persian rule. No political entity before or since has reached that proportion relative to the global population of the time. The ceremonial capital was Persepolis, whose construction took 60 years and whose ruins, located 56 kilometers from the city of Shiraz in modern Iran, can still be visited. Ciro, o Grande, the founder of this empire, is the only non-Israelite ruler to be called anointed Messiah in the Old Testament texts. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1, modern Iran knows this, and it has not forgotten a single detail. The Revolution Islamica of 1979 was not just a change of political regime. It was the affirmation of a millennial imperial identity dressed in religious and ideological language. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was not just establishing a theocracy, he was reclaiming for Iran the role of central power in the Middle East that Persia had occupied for centuries. The export of the revolution, the creation of Hezbollah in Lebanon in 1982, the systematic funding of armed groups in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, the development of a nuclear program that cost the country more than $300 billion in economic losses due to sanctions. All of this follows a logic that is simultaneously religious, imperial, and strategic. The sphere of influence that Iran is building today is the mirror of the sphere of influence that Persia occupied 2,500 years ago. Daniel's ram pushed to the west, to the north, and to the south. Remember the directions. Now look at the map in detail. Hezbollah, created and funded by Iran with an annual budget estimated at more than $700 million, operates in Lebanon, which is west of Iran. The Houthis, armed with anti-ship missiles and long-range drones supplied by Iran, control vast regions of Yemen. To the south, Iranian militias in Iraq, which number more than 60 distinct armed groups under the umbrella of the Forces de Mobilisation Populaire, operate to the north and northwest. Damascus in Syria was for years the transit corridor through which Iranian weapons reached Hezbollah. At no point in recent history has Iran attempted to expand its influence to the east, toward Pakistan or Afghanistan, with the same intensity and coherence with which it pushes in the three other directions. Daniel's text is specific: west, north, and south, not east. The actual expansion pattern follows the pattern described in the document with a fidelity that no contemporary strategist consciously planned. 2,500 years of directional consistency. Factor in the human cost of this pattern, because as impressive as the geographic and geopolitical precision of the prophecy may be, what remains invisible in the numbers and analyses are the people who pay the price for the pieces moving on this board. The closing of the Estreito de Ormuz was not just a commodity crisis, it was a humanitarian crisis that unfolded in slow motion and that markets began to price in before most people understood what was happening. Countries like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and several nations in East Africa and South Asia, which were already operating with minimal fuel reserves after years of economic pressure, entered a supply collapse in less than 2 weeks after the closure. Hospital generators were shut down for lack of diesel. Water pumping systems that depend on fuel-generated electricity stopped working in rural areas that have no access to the power grid. Food distribution chains that depend on refrigeration broke down, leading to the loss of tons of perishable products in countries that have no margin for wasting food. Nations that were not actors in any geopolitical conflict paid, with the lives of ordinary civilians, the price of a power struggle happening thousands of kilometers away. This is always the invisible cost of the great power boards. And observe what the prophetic texts say about this specific cost. The Book of Apocalypse, chapter 18, verses 11 to 13, describes the lament of the merchants of the earth when the great global commercial system collapses. No one buys their merchandise anymore. The list of products mentions gold, silver, precious stones, fine linen, precious woods, ivory, copper, iron, marble, and ends with the bodies and souls of men. The text does not romanticize the system's collapse. It records the lament of those who depended on it. The prophet does not celebrate the crisis. He documents the human cost of a structure built on a foundation that had an expiration date inscribed in its very nature. The global energy market is built on 33 kilometers of water, controlled by one of the most sanctioned nations on the planet, which has openly declared on multiple occasions its willingness to use this geographic position as a weapon. This is the foundation. And no diplomatic summit, no collective security agreement, and no aircraft carrier fleet resolves the underlying issue, because the underlying issue is not logistical. It is prophetic. Measure what this means in concrete terms of systemic vulnerability. Japan imports approximately 87% of all the oil it consumes, almost everything the country needs to function. Of that total, more than 90% passes through the Estreito de Ormuz. Japanese strategic reserves last around 180 days under normal consumption, and normal consumption during a supply crisis does not exist because crises trigger emergency demand that compresses reserves much more quickly. Korea do Sul has a similar dependency, with strategic reserves calculated for approximately 90 days. China, which consumes more than 14 millions of barrels per day, depends on the Estreito for an essential portion of its supply, despite efforts over the last years to diversify land routes through Asia Central. When Ormuz closes, the clock starts ticking simultaneously in dozens of capitals at once, and each government has only weeks, not months, not years, to find a solution that does not exist. None of these nations has a plan B that works on the necessary scale. And here is the data that market analysts know and rarely say out loud. Iran knows all of this with a precision that any intelligence service would envy. The closing of the Estreito de Ormuz is not an empty threat uttered in moments of diplomatic frustration. It is a real, documented, rehearsed lever available as a first-order strategic coercion instrument. In 2012, faced with the progressive increase of Western sanctions related to the nuclear program, Iranian Vice President Mohammad Reza Rahimi publicly declared that Iran would close the strait if sanctions continued to advance. In 2018, after the Estados Unidos unilaterally withdrew from the nuclear deal, then President Hassan Rouhani said explicitly that Iran could prevent any nation from exporting oil through the region. In 2023, Admiral Ali Shamkhani, Secretary of the Iranian National Security Council, reaffirmed that Iran had the full technical and doctrinal capacity to block navigation in the strait in the event of open conflict. This is not rhetoric for domestic consumption. This is strategic doctrine deliberately communicated to the entire world. And when the doctrine became operation, the world reacted exactly as any honest observer could have predicted, with disorientation, with market panic, with emergency summons, with hastily prepared analyses, and with no reference to the only document that had described that scenario centuries in advance, with precision of name, direction, and dynamics. The text was there. It was accessible. It was translated into more than 2,200 languages, distributed in billions of copies around the world. No one read it. Or rather, they read it, but not as a verifiable historical document. They read it as a religious text, as faith literature, as a set of personal beliefs, never as a long-term strategic intelligence archive. This is the most expensive categorization error in modern history, treating as spiritual metaphor what was written as an operational description of future events. Place this fragment within the larger context of what scholars call the prophetic arc of the Middle East. There is no nation in the prophetic literature of the Old Testament that is more consistently mentioned as an end-times actor than Persia, with the exception of Israel, which is the axis around which the entire arc turns. Persia appears in Daniel, in Ezekiel, in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, in Esther, and in Esdras. In some texts as a providential ally, in others as an instrument of pressure, in others as a force that needs to be bent, in others as an opponent rising against the established purpose. But it is always present, always named, always positioned at the center of events that determine the course of the region's history. And it still is, in 2024. In 2025. At this very moment, as you read or hear these words, what the world continues to call a regional crisis is, in the language of the texts, the advancement of a movement that has a defined direction and a recorded destination. Ezekiel 38 does not describe a war that ends in a diplomatic stalemate. It describes a convergence, a coordinated march, a coalition moving toward Israel with the conviction that victory is possible, and finds in the text a response that comes from no human army, from no anti-missile defense system, from no Western military alliance. This is the detail that geopolitical analysts do not put into the equation because no measurable indicator exists for it. And geopolitics works with verifiable and quantifiable forces, with naval tonnage, with nuclear warheads, with foreign exchange reserves, with refining capacity, with missile range and military personnel. These are the correct metrics for understanding what is happening in the short term, for the next quarter, for the next summit, for the next round of sanctions. But Ezekiel 38 is not a short-term analysis document. It is a long-term record that operates on a completely different timescale. It is an archive that describes the outcome of a process that is underway, and that affirms, with the same precision with which it named Persia centuries before Iran existed as a political concept, that this process has a defined, specific end, unalterable by any human negotiation. The world continued to negotiate after the Estreito de Ormuz was reopened. New rounds of sanctions were announced with solemnity. New agreements were placed on the table with diplomatic pomp. New statements from chancellors were broadcast live on news channels that soon after moved on to the next crisis. The mechanism continued to function as it always has, as if the problem were new, as if the solution were within reach of available tools, as if the root of the conflict were economic or ideological or political or some manageable combination of the three. The Estreito de Ormuz remains the point of greatest geopolitical pressure on the planet. No diplomatic agreement has resolved the central issue. No sanction has changed the direction of power consolidating in that region. The world continues to negotiate as if the problem were economic, as if the solution were political, as if the root were recent. The book of Ezekiel, chapter 38, does not describe a crisis. It describes a movement, a convergence of nations around Israel that does not end at a negotiating table. It ends in direct confrontation. What the world is managing as regional instability, the text records as the beginning of a sequence that has a specific outcome, described with names, with geographic directions, and with a final result. The coalition the text describes is not being formed in secret. It is being formed before cameras, in public statements, in signed military agreements, in joint exercises broadcast on the state television of each of the countries involved. The arc has not closed, and what is happening now is not the peak of the crisis. It is the prologue.